The sun beat down on Iron Hollow like a hammer on an anvil, and the dust rose in lazy spirals from the unpaved main street. It was the kind of town that had seen better days, if it had ever seen them at all. Weathered storefronts leaned against each other like drunks after closing time, and the few people who moved through the heat did so with the slow, resigned gait of those who'd stopped expecting much from life. Rhea Callahan rode in on a bay mare that had seen more miles than most horses twice her age. The mare's coat was dark with sweat, her ears flicking at flies, but she moved with the steady confidence of an animal that trusted the woman on her back. Rhea sat easy in the saddle, her hat pulled low against the glare, her canvas jacket dusty and worn at the elbows. She wasn't tall, wasn't particularly striking at first glance, just a lean woman with sun-dark skin and eyes that took in everything and gave nothing back. She'd been riding for 3 days straight, sleeping rough, and eating jerky that tasted like boot leather, and she was bone-tired. But tired didn't matter. Not now. The Iron Hollow saloon squatted at the end of the street like a toad in the shade. Rhea tied her mare to the hitching post and pushed through the batwing doors. Inside, the air was thick with tobacco smoke and the sour smell of yesterday's beer. A handful of men sat at tables, playing cards with the kind of bored intensity that spoke of too much time and too little money. Behind the bar, a man with a belly like a feed sack and a mustache that drooped past his jowls looked up without much interest. "Help you?" "Looking for the Holt Ranch," Rhea said. Her voice was low, rough around the edges, the voice of someone who'd spent more time talking to horses than people. "Heard they've got a horse problem." One of the card players snorted. He was a big man, thick through the shoulders, with hands that looked like they could bend horseshoes. "That what you heard?" "That's what I heard." "Well, you heard right, but if you're thinking you're going to be the one to fix it, you got another think coming." Rhea didn't rise to the bait. She'd been doing this long enough to know that every town had at least one loudmouth who thought the world needed his opinion. "The ranch," she repeated, looking back at the bartender. "How do I find it?" The bartender jerked his thumb toward the window. 4 miles northwest. Follow the creek bed till you see the cottonwoods. Can't miss it." He paused, his eyes flicking over her. "You a horsebreaker?" "Something like that." "Good luck then. You're going to need it." The big man at the table let out a bark of laughter. "Luck ain't got nothing to do with it. That horse is the devil himself. Broke Clem Johnson's arm in 2 places. Near killed Pete Garrison. And you think you're just going to waltz in there and, what? Talk to him nice?" Rhea turned to face him. Her expression didn't change, but something in her eyes made the man's grin falter. "I think," she said quietly, "that I'll do what I came here to do. And you can think whatever you want." She walked out before he could respond. The Holt Ranch sat in a shallow valley, ringed by hills that looked like the bones of the earth pushing through dry skin. The house was a 2-story structure that had probably been white once, but was now the color of old teeth. Outbuildings clustered around it. A barn, a bunkhouse, a workshop with a sagging roof. Fences crisscrossed the property, most of them in need of mending, and a few head of cattle grazed listlessly in the distance. But Rhea's attention was on the corral. It was set apart from the other structures, built heavy and strong with posts as thick as a man's thigh. Inside, a black stallion paced the perimeter like a caged storm. He was huge, 17 hands if he was an inch, with a coat that gleamed like wet coal in the sunlight. His mane was wild and tangled, his tail lashing behind him, and every line of his body screamed rage and defiance. Even from 50 yards away, Rhea could feel the energy coming off him. Raw, untamed, dangerous. She'd seen a lot of horses in her life. Gentle ones and mean ones, smart ones and dumb ones, horses that wanted to please and horses that wanted to kill you. But she'd never seen one quite like this. A man was leaning against the corral fence, watching the stallion with the kind of stillness that comes from long practice. He was in his 40s, Rhea guessed, with graying hair and a face that had been handsome once, but was now carved into hard lines by sun and worry. He wore a dusty shirt and jeans that had been patched more than once, and his boots were scuffed nearly white. Rhea dismounted and led her mare over. "You Darren Holt?" The man didn't look at her. "I am. Rhea Callahan. I heard you've got a horse that needs working with." Now he did look at her. His eyes were blue, faded like denim, left too long in the sun. "Word travels fast." Word travels when there's something worth talking about. Darren's gaze flicked back to the stallion. That your way of saying you think you can handle him? I'm saying I'd like to try. People have tried. I'm not people. He almost smiled at that. Almost. No offense, Miss Callahan, but I've had 6 men come through here in the last 2 months. Big men, strong men, men who've been breaking horses since before you were born, I'd wager. And every single one of them left with less pride than they came in with. Some of them left with less blood, too. Rhea tied her mare to a post and walked up to the fence. The stallion wheeled to face her, his ears pinned flat, his eyes rolling white. He snorted once, a sound like distant thunder, and pawed the ground hard enough to raise a cloud of dust. What's his name? Rhea asked. Vortex. Why? Darren shrugged. Because when he gets going, it's like standing in the middle of a tornado. You don't control it. You just hope you survive it. Rhea studied the horse. He was watching her now, every muscle tensed, ready to explode. But there was something else there, too. Something beneath the rage. What happened to him? She asked. Darren was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer. Don't rightly know. Found him running wild up in the high country about a year ago. He was tangled in old barbed wire, half-starved, bleeding. Should have died, probably. I brought him down here, patched him up, figured I'd gentle him and sell him for a decent price. He shook his head. That didn't work out. He remember the wire? Maybe. Maybe he remembers worse. All I know is he doesn't trust anyone, and he damn sure doesn't let anyone ride him. Why keep him? Darren's jaw tightened. Because my daughter asked me to. As if on cue, a girl appeared from the barn. She couldn't have been more than 10, with dark braids and a smudge of dirt on one cheek. She walked over to the fence and slipped her hand into her father's without a word, staring up at the stallion with a mix of awe and longing. This is Maggie, Darren said. Maggie, this is Miss Callahan. You gonna ride Vortex? The girl asked. Her voice was small but steady. Rhea glanced at her, then back at the horse. I'm gonna try. Papa says he's not mean. He's just scared. Darren looked down at his daughter, and something in his face softened. That's what your mama used to say. The girl's expression didn't change, but Rhea saw the way her hand tightened around her father's. Rhea didn't ask about the mother. She didn't need to. Grief had a way of leaving marks, and Darren Holt wore his like a brand. So what do you say? Rhea asked, turning back to Darren. You willing to let me work with him? Darren studied her for a long moment. You got money for a doctor if this goes sideways? I've got money. And you're sure about this? Because I won't have your death on my conscience. I'm sure. He sighed, the kind of sigh that carried the weight of too many losses. All right, you can stay in the bunkhouse. Meals are at 6 in the morning and 6 at night. You work when you want, but you don't get in the way of my hands. And if Vortex puts you in the dirt hard enough, you pack up and leave. Deal? Rhea held out her hand. Deal. His grip was firm, calloused, the handshake of a man who'd spent his life working with his hands. One more thing, he said. Don't get Maggie's hopes up. She's already lost enough. Rhea looked down at the girl, who was watching her with solemn, serious eyes. I'll do my best not to. The bunkhouse was exactly what Rhea expected. 4 narrow cots, a potbelly stove, and a pervasive smell of sweat and old leather. 2 of the cots were occupied by ranch hands who eyed her with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. One was a wiry Mexican man with a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. The other was younger, maybe early 20s, with red hair and freckles that made him look like he should still be in school. Heard you're here for the horse, the older man said. His English was accented but clear. I'm Luis. That's Red. Red gave a nod but didn't say anything. Rhea, she said, dropping her pack on the empty cot. And yeah, I'm here for the horse. Luis grinned, but it wasn't a friendly grin. You know how many people said that same thing? 6. 6 men, all bigger than you, all meaner than you, all thinking they'd be the one to break him. You know what happened? They didn't. Damn right they didn't. Last guy, big son of a bitch from Wyoming, tried to rope him and drag him down. Vortex damn near ripped his arm off. Took 3 of us to get him out of that corral alive. Sounds like he deserved it, Rhea said mildly. Luis blinked. What? If you try to drag a scared animal down with a rope, you get what's coming to you. Red snorted, almost a laugh. Luis frowned. You think you're smarter than him? Is that it? I think, Rhea said, unlacing her boots, that if you treat a horse like a problem to be solved instead of a living thing to be understood, you're going to lose every time. Well, good luck with that philosophy when he's stomping on your ribs. Rhea stretched out on the cot and tipped her hat over her face. Thanks for the concern. She woke before dawn the next morning, slipping out of the bunkhouse while the others still snored. The air was cold and clean, and the sky was the deep purple black of pre-dawn. Rhea walked to the corral, moving slow and quiet, and stood at the fence. Vortex was at the far end, his head up, his ears swiveling toward her. He didn't move, didn't charge, just watched. Rhea didn't try to approach. She just stood there, hands on the fence, breathing slow and steady. After a few minutes, the stallion took a step forward, then another. His nostrils flared as he scented the air, his eyes locked on hers. Hey, Rhea said softly, I'm not here to hurt you. Vortex snorted and tossed his head, but he didn't back away. I know you've had a rough time. I get it, but I'm not like the others. I'm not going to force you into anything. I'm just going to be here. And if you ever want to trust me, that's your choice, not mine. The stallion stared at her for a long moment, then turned and trotted back to the far side of the corral, his tail high. Rhea watched him go, a faint smile touching her lips. Day one, she murmured. Not bad. Well, the first week was nothing but waiting. Rhea showed up at the corral every morning before sunrise and every evening after the day's work was done. She didn't bring ropes or whips or any of the tools the other men had tried. She just brought herself, standing at the fence, talking in a low, steady voice. Sometimes she talked about the weather. Sometimes she talked about horses she'd known. Sometimes she didn't talk at all, just stood there in companionable silence. Vortex didn't come closer, but he didn't ignore her either. He watched. He paced. He snorted and stamped and threw his head, but every day he seemed a little less frantic, a little less desperate. The ranch hands thought she was insane. You're wasting your time, Luis said one evening as they sat around the bunkhouse stove. That horse is never going to let you near him. Maybe, Rhea said, whittling a piece of wood with her pocket knife. Maybe not. You got a bet going? Red asked suddenly. It was the first full sentence he'd said to her all week. Rhea glanced up. With who? Yourself. You seem like the type, she grinned. What makes you think that? Because you're crazy enough to be here in the first place. Luis laughed at that, and even Rhea had to admit it was fair. On the 8th day, Vortex walked up to the fence while she was standing there. Rhea's heart kicked in her chest, but she didn't move, didn't reach out, just kept breathing, slow and steady, while the stallion stretched his neck toward her, nostrils flaring. He was close enough that she could see the scars on his chest, pale lines against the black of his coat. Close enough that she could hear the low rumble of his breathing. Hey, she said softly. There you are. Vortex's ears flicked forward, then back. He held her gaze for a long, tense moment, and then he turned and walked away. Rhea let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Progress, she murmured. The second week she started bringing apples. Not in her hand, that would have been too much, too soon. She just left them on the fence post, close enough that Vortex would smell them, and then she walked away. The first day he ignored them. The second day, he circled them warily. By the third day, they were gone. After that, she started cutting them into pieces and leaving them in different spots around the corral. Vortex would find them, sniff them, and eventually eat them. And every time he did, Rhea would be standing at the fence, watching. You're bribing him, Luis said, shaking his head. I'm building trust, Rhea corrected. Same thing. Not even close. But by the end of the second week, Vortex would approach the fence while she was there. He wouldn't let her touch him. Not yet. But he'd stand a few feet away, watching her with those dark, wary eyes. And Rhea would talk to him, her voice soft and steady, telling him about the world outside the corral. You ever see the mountains in winter? She asked one evening, leaning against the fence. Snow so white it hurts to look at. Air so cold it burns your lungs. But there's something about it, something clean, like the world just hit a reset button, you know? Vortex's ears flicked toward her. I grew up in a place like that. Little ranch, way up in the high country. My old man was a tough son of a bitch, but he loved horses more than he loved most people. Taught me everything I know." She paused, her gaze distant. "He's been gone 5 years now. Sometimes I think he'd be proud of what I'm doing. Other times I think he'd tell me I was wasting my time on a horse with more demons than sense." The stallion snorted, and Rhea laughed softly. "Yeah, you'd probably agree with him. On the 15th day, a man rode into the ranch. He was everything Rhea wasn't, big, loud, and brimming with the kind of confidence that came from never being told no. His name was Garrett Kane, and he made sure everyone knew it within 5 minutes of arriving. He wore expensive boots, a silver-trimmed saddle, and a hat that looked like it cost more than Rhea's entire outfit. "Heard you've got a problem horse," Kane said, swinging down from his mount and striding toward the corral like he owned the place. "Figured I'd come take a look." Darren came out of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. His expression was carefully neutral. "Didn't send for you." "Didn't have to. Word gets around." Kane leaned against the fence, eyeing Vortex with the kind of appraisal you'd give a piece of meat. "Hell of an animal. Be worth a fortune if someone could break him proper. He's not for sale." "Everything's for sale if the price is right." Darren's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Rhea stepped forward. "He's not interested." Kane turned, noticing her for the first time. His eyebrows went up. "And you are?" "Nobody important." "Then maybe you should let the men handle this conversation." Rhea's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Maybe you should leave before you embarrass yourself." Kane's expression darkened. "You got a mouth on you, and you've got about 10 seconds to walk back to your horse before I make you wish you had." For a moment, the air was so tense you could have struck a match on it. Kane's hand twitched toward his belt, not to a gun, but to a coiled whip hanging there. Rhea didn't move. "All right," Darren said, stepping between them. "That's enough. Kane, you're not wanted here. Mount up and ride out." Kane's eyes flicked between Darren and Rhea, and then he laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "Fine, but when that horse kills someone, don't say I didn't offer to help." He turned and strode back to his mount, swinging up into the saddle with the kind of theatrical flair that made Rhea's skin crawl. He spurred his horse hard, and the animal lunged forward, startled and off balance. As he rode away, Maggie appeared at Rhea's side, her small hand slipping into Rhea's. "I don't like him," she said quietly. "Neither do I, kid." That night, Rhea couldn't sleep. She lay on her cot, staring at the ceiling, listening to Luis and Red snore in the darkness. Something about Kane's visit had left a bad taste in her mouth, not just because he was an ass, but because she'd seen the way he looked at Vortex, like the horse was a prize to be won, a problem to be dominated. She'd seen men like him before. They were the ones who thought strength meant breaking something until it bent to your will. They didn't understand that real strength came from knowing when to yield, when to wait, when to let the other creature come to you on their own terms. Finally, she gave up on sleep and slipped outside. The night was cool and clear, the stars scattered across the sky like someone had thrown a handful of diamonds into the black. Rhea walked to the corral, her boots crunching softly on the gravel, and leaned against the fence. Vortex was standing in the center of the corral, his head up, his ears swiveling toward her. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. "You and me," Rhea said softly, "we're not so different, you know. Both of us got scars we don't like to talk about. Both of us learned the hard way that trust is a luxury most folks can't afford." The stallion took a step toward her, then another. Rhea's breath caught in her throat. Vortex walked across the corral, slow and deliberate, until he was standing at the fence, close enough that Rhea could reach out and touch him. She didn't. Instead, she just stood there, her hands resting lightly on the top rail, and let the stallion decide. For a long, breathless moment, nothing happened, and then Vortex stretched his neck forward, his nose brushing against her shoulder. It was the lightest touch, barely more than a whisper of contact, but it hit Rhea like a thunderbolt. She stayed perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe, while the stallion sniffed her jacket, her hair, her hands. "There you are," she whispered. Vortex pulled back, his eyes on hers, and for the first time Rhea saw something in them that wasn't rage or fear. It was curiosity. The next morning, she started working with him in earnest. She didn't try to ride him, not yet. Instead, she focused on the basics, getting him used to her presence inside the corral, teaching him that she wasn't a threat. She moved slowly, deliberately, always giving him space to retreat if he wanted. And more often than not, he didn't. It wasn't smooth. There were days when Vortex would charge at her, teeth bared, forcing her to scramble up the fence. There were days when he'd ignore her completely, pacing the perimeter like she wasn't even there. But there were also days when he'd walk up to her, curious and cautious, and let her stand close enough to feel the heat radiating off his body. "You're actually doing it," Red said one afternoon, watching from outside the corral. He sounded amazed. "Don't jinx it," Rhea said, keeping her eyes on the stallion. Luis shook his head. "I still think you're crazy." "Probably." Chess. 3 weeks in, Rhea touched him for the first time. It was early morning, the sun just starting to crest the hills, and Vortex had walked up to her of his own accord. Rhea stood still, her hand hanging loose at her side, and waited. The stallion sniffed her fingers, his breath warm and damp, and then, slowly, tentatively, he lowered his head. Rhea lifted her hand and rested it on his neck. Vortex's muscles jumped under her palm, but he didn't pull away. Rhea kept her touch light, just her fingertips against his coat, and murmured soft nonsense words that didn't mean anything except, "I'm here. You're safe." When she finally stepped back, her hand was trembling. By the end of the 4th week, she could run her hands over most of his body, his neck, his shoulders, his flanks. He still flinched sometimes, still shied away from her touch near his head or his legs, but he was learning, slowly, painfully, but learning. And then Garrett Kane came back. This time, he brought friends. They rode in like they owned the world. 3 men on horseback, dust rising behind them in the midday heat. Garrett Kane led the way, sitting tall in that expensive saddle, his face set with the kind of smugness that made Rhea want to knock his teeth down his throat. The 2 men flanking him were cut from the same cloth. Big, mean-looking, with the swagger of men who'd never been told they couldn't have something. Rhea was in the corral with Vortex when they arrived. She'd been working with him on desensitization, getting him used to the feel of a blanket across his back, the weight of it settling over his spine. It was slow work, requiring patience and a light touch, and Vortex had just started to relax when the sound of hoofbeats shattered the quiet. The stallion's head snapped up, his ears pinned flat. Rhea felt the shift in him immediately, the tension coiling through his muscles, the wild panic flickering back into his eyes. "Easy," she murmured, keeping her voice low and steady. "You're all right." But Vortex wasn't listening. His focus was locked on the approaching riders, his nostrils flaring, his whole body vibrating with barely contained energy. Rhea moved slowly toward the fence, giving him space, and climbed out just as Kane and his crew pulled up outside the corral. "Well, well," Kane said, swinging down from his horse with theatrical ease. "Look at this! The little lady's still playing horse whisperer." Rhea didn't respond. She closed the gate behind her, securing the latch, and turned to face him with her arms crossed. "Darren around?" Kane asked, glancing toward the house. "He's out checking the fences." "Shame. I was hoping to have a word with him." Kane's smile didn't reach his eyes. "But maybe you can help me out. See, I've been thinking about that horse of his. Been thinking a lot, actually, and I've come to a decision." "That's so?" "That's so. I'm buying him." Rhea's jaw tightened. "He's not for sale." "Everything's for sale, sweetheart. Just a matter of finding the right price." Kane nodded to one of his companions, a thick-necked man with a face like a side of beef. "This here's Bull, best horsebreaker in 3 counties, and that's Clyde." He gestured to the other man, leaner, but no less dangerous looking. "Between the 3 of us, we've broken more horses than you've probably even seen." "Congratulations," Rhea said flatly. "Now get off the property." Kane's smile widened. "See, that's the thing. I don't think I will. Because I think Holt's been wasting time and money on a lost cause, and I think he'd be smart to cut his losses. So here's what's going to happen. We're going to take that stallion off his hands, for a fair price, of course, and we're going to do what should have been done weeks ago. Which is? Break him proper." Rhea's blood went cold. "You touch that horse and I'll—" "You'll what?" Kane stepped closer, towering over her. "You gonna fight all 3 of us? You gonna stop us?" Before Rhea could answer, Darren's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "No, but I will." They all turned. Darren was striding across the yard, his face like stone, a rifle cradled in the crook of his arm. Luis and Red flanked him, both armed, both looking ready for trouble. Kane straightened, his hand resting casually on his belt. Holt, good to see you. Can't say the feeling's mutual. Now don't be like that. I'm here to make you an offer. I'm not interested. You haven't even heard it yet. Don't need to. That horse isn't for sale, and neither is anything else on this property. So you and your boys can turn around and ride back the way you came. Kane's expression hardened. You're making a mistake. Wouldn't be the first time. For a long, tense moment, the two men stared at each other. Ria's hand drifted toward the knife sheathed at her belt, her pulse hammering in her ears. She could feel the violence simmering just beneath the surface, waiting for one wrong word to ignite it. Finally, Kane smiled, a cold, humorless thing. All right, Holt, have it your way. But when that horse kills someone, don't come crying to me. He turned and mounted his horse, jerking the reins hard enough to make the animal toss its head. Bull and Clyde followed suit, and the three of them rode out, leaving a trail of dust and unspoken threats in their wake. Ria let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Darren lowered the rifle, his knuckles white around the stock. That's not the end of it, Luis said quietly. I know, Darren replied. His voice was tired. But it'll have to do for now. Ria looked back in the corral. Vortex was at the far end, pacing frantically, his head high and his eyes rolling. All the progress they'd made over the past 4 weeks, all the trust she'd painstakingly built, felt like it was unraveling before her eyes. I need to go to him, she said. Darren caught her arm. Give him time to settle first. He's too worked up right now. He needs to know I'm here. And he will, but not like this. You go in there now and you're just going to get hurt. Ria wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. She could see it in Vortex's body language, the frantic energy, the wild desperation. He wasn't the horse she'd been working with for the past month. He was the broken, terrified animal she'd first seen in that corral, and pushing him now would only make things worse. She stayed at the fence, though. Stayed there until the sun dipped below the hills and the shadows grew long, her hands gripping the top rail so hard her knuckles ached. And slowly, painfully, Vortex began to calm. His pacing slowed, his head lowered, and finally, as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, he walked over to the fence and stood there, just out of reach. I'm here, Ria said softly. I'm not going anywhere. The stallion's ears flicked toward her, and after a moment he took one step closer, then another, and then he pressed his nose against her outstretched hand, warm and solid and real. Ria closed her eyes and let out a shaky breath. That's it. That's my boy. Behind her, Darren watched from the porch, his daughter's small hand tucked into his. And for the first time in a long time, he felt something he'd almost forgotten. Hope. The next week brought rain, cold, driving rain that turned the roads to mud and the ranch into a sodden mess. Ria spent most of her time in the barn, working with Vortex in the enclosed space, getting him used to the saddle blanket, the girth, the feel of leather against his skin. It was tedious, repetitive work, but she didn't mind. Every small victory, every moment when he didn't flinch, didn't bolt, was a step forward. Louise and Red had stopped making jokes. Now they just watched, fascinated despite themselves, as Ria coaxed the stallion through each new challenge. Even Maggie started spending her afternoons at the barn, perched on a hay bale with her knees pulled up to her chest, her eyes wide with wonder. How do you know what to do? The girl asked one afternoon. Ria adjusted the girth strap, her hands moving slow and sure. I don't, always. Mostly I just pay attention. Watch how he moves, how he breathes, where he's holding tension. Horses talk to you, if you know how to listen. What's he saying now? Ria glanced at Vortex. The stallion was standing still, his eyes half closed, his weight shifted onto one hip. He's saying he's tired but not scared. That's a good place to be. Maggie was quiet for a moment. Then, in a small voice, she said, Mama used to say the same thing. Ria stilled. She didn't look at the girl, didn't push, just kept her hands on the saddle and waited. She loved horses, Maggie continued. She said they were like people, just better at being honest. Your mama was a smart woman. She got sick last winter. Papa tried everything, but the girl's voice trailed off. Ria turned then, crouching down so she was at Maggie's eye level. I'm sorry, kid. That's a hard thing to carry. Maggie's eyes were bright with unshed tears, but she didn't cry. Papa won't talk about her. He just works all the time. I think he's scared if he stops, he'll remember too much. Rhea reached out and squeezed the girl's shoulder. Grief's like that sometimes. Makes people do strange things. But he loves you, Maggie. That much I know for sure. The girl nodded, swiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. You think Vortex is scared like that? Scared to remember? Rhea looked back at the stallion. Yeah, she said quietly. I think maybe he is. By the 5th week, Rhea had the saddle on him. It wasn't easy. The first time she tried, Vortex exploded, bucking, twisting, slamming his body against the fence with enough force to rattle the posts. Rhea got out of the way just in time, her heart pounding, and watched as the stallion tore around the corral like a demon unleashed. That went well, Luis muttered from outside the fence. Shut up, Rhea said, but there was no heat in it. The second time, she waited until Vortex was calm, then worked the saddle onto his back in stages. First just resting it there, then cinching it loosely, then tighter. He danced and snorted, his eyes rolling, but he didn't explode. And by the 3rd time, he stood still, his muscles quivering but his hooves planted. Good boy, Rhea murmured, running her hand along his neck. You're doing so good. Darren leaned against the fence, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. You really think you can ride him? I know I can. When? Rhea looked at the stallion, at the way he was holding himself, tense but not terrified, wary but not wild. Soon, Pots. That night, Rhea couldn't sleep again. She lay on her cot, staring at the ceiling, her mind churning. She kept thinking about Cain, about the look in his eyes when he'd threatened to take Vortex. Men like him didn't give up easy. They just waited for the right moment, the right opening, and then they struck. Finally, she gave up on rest and slipped outside. The night was clear and cold, the air sharp enough to sting her lungs. She walked to the corral, her boots crunching on the frost-hardened ground, and found Vortex standing in the center, his breath misting in the moonlight. Can't sleep either, huh? She said softly. The stallion's ears swiveled toward her, and he walked over, pressing his nose against her chest. Rhea wrapped her arms around his neck, feeling the warmth of him, the solid reality of muscle and bone and life. I won't let them take you, she whispered. I don't care what it costs. You're not going back to that. Vortex exhaled, his breath warm against her jacket, and for a moment Rhea felt the weight of the promise she'd just made. It was a stupid promise, maybe, a reckless one, but it was hers, and she meant it. The next morning, everything changed. Rhea was in the barn, mucking out stalls, when Darren came striding in, his face pale and his jaw tight. We've got a problem. She straightened, her gut clenching. What kind of problem? The kind that involves a lawyer and a land deed. He thrust a piece of paper at her. Kane's filed a claim on the water rights to Black Creek. Says he's got documentation proving his family owned it before mine did. Rhea scanned the document, her heart sinking. Can he do that? If the claim holds up, yeah. And if he controls the water, he controls the ranch. Without that creek, we can't water the cattle, can't irrigate the fields. We'd be finished inside a month. So we fight it. With what? I've got about $300 to my name and a mortgage I'm already behind on. Kane's got money, lawyers, and half the county on his side. Rhea's hands tightened on the paper. There's got to be something we can do. There is. Darren's voice was flat. I can sell him the ranch, cut my losses, take Maggie, and start over somewhere else. You can't do that. Watch me. Darren, this is my land, Rhea, my responsibility, and I'm not going to let my pride destroy my daughter's future. Before Rhea could respond, Maggie appeared in the doorway, her face streaked with tears. Papa, no. You promised. Darren's expression cracked, just for a moment, and then he was kneeling in front of his daughter, his hands on her shoulders. I know, sweetheart, but sometimes promises aren't enough. Mama wouldn't want you to give up. Your mama's not here. The words were harsh, harsher than Darren probably intended, and Maggie flinched like she'd been struck. She pulled away from him and ran, her footsteps echoing through the barn. Darren closed his eyes, his shoulders sagging. I didn't mean, I know, Rhea said quietly. But she's right. You can't give up. Not yet. Then what do you suggest? Rhea was quiet for a long moment, her mind racing. And then, slowly, an idea began to form. It was risky. Probably stupid. But it was the only chance they had. "The water rights," she said. "Where's the documentation supposed to be?" "County Records Office, but Kane's claiming the original deed is in a safe deposit box in Silver Ridge." "How far is Silver Ridge?" 2 days' ride, maybe 3, depending on the terrain. Darren frowned. "Why?" "Because if that deed exists, we need to see it. And if it doesn't, or if it's been forged, we need proof." "And how exactly do you plan to get that proof?" Rhea met his eyes. "Leave that to me." "What?" She left before dawn the next morning, saddling her mare in the gray pre-light while the rest of the ranch still slept. She'd packed light, a bedroll, some jerky, a canteen, and her knife. The ride to Silver Ridge would be hard and fast, and she didn't have time for anything that would slow her down. She was halfway to the barn door when Darren stepped out of the shadows, his arms crossed. "You planning to tell me what you're doing, or am I supposed to guess?" Rhea didn't break stride. "I'm riding to Silver Ridge, gonna see if I can get a look at that deed." "Alone? Unless you've got someone else who can go." Darren fell into step beside her. "You know this is insane, right? Even if you find the deed, even if it's forged, Kane's not gonna just roll over. He's got money, connections, and I've got a stubborn streak a mile wide and nothing to lose." Rhea swung up into the saddle. "Look, I know the odds, but if there's even a chance we can stop him, I'm taking it." Darren was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching hers. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "This is the name of a clerk at the county office. Woman named Iris. She used to work for my father back before he passed. If anyone can help you, it's her." Rhea took the paper, tucking it into her jacket. "Thanks." "And Rhea?" His voice was softer now, edged with something she couldn't quite name. "Be careful." She gave him a lopsided smile. "Always am." The ride to Silver Ridge was brutal. Rhea pushed her mare hard, stopping only to water her and let her graze for a few hours before mounting up again. The terrain was rough, rocky hills and dry creek beds that turned treacherous in the dark, and more than once Rhea had to dismount and lead her horse through the worst of it. By the time she reached the outskirts of Silver Ridge on the second day, she was bone-tired, her body aching from hours in the saddle. But she didn't stop. She rode straight to the county records office, a squat brick building on the edge of town, and tied her mare to the hitching post outside. The clerk at the front desk was a thin, bird-like woman with spectacles perched on the end of her nose. She looked up as Rhea entered, her expression politely disinterested. "Can I help you?" "I'm looking for Iris." The woman's eyebrows rose. "And who's asking?" "Friend of Darren Holt's." The woman's expression shifted, just slightly. "Wait here." She disappeared through a door at the back, and a few minutes later an older woman emerged. Iris was in her 60s, with gray hair pulled into a tight bun and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She looked Rhea up and down, taking in the dusty clothes and the exhaustion etched into her face. "You're Holt's friend?" "That's right. Come with me." Iris led her into a cramped office filled with filing cabinets and stacks of yellowing paper. She closed the door behind them and turned to face Rhea, her arms crossed. "I heard about the claim on Black Creek. Nasty business. Can you help me?" "Depends. What are you looking for?" "The original deed. The one Kane says proves his family owned the water rights." Iris's expression darkened. "I've seen that deed. It's in the records." Rhea's heart sank. "So it's real?" "Real, sure. Legitimate. That's another question." Iris moved to one of the filing cabinets and pulled out a thick folder. "This is the deed in question. Take a look." Rhea opened the folder, her eyes scanning the yellowed paper inside. The document was old, the ink faded, but the words were clear enough. A land transfer dated 1847, granting water rights to the Kane family. It looked official, complete with a wax seal and signatures. But something about it felt wrong. "The paper," Rhea said slowly. "It's too clean." Iris's eyes glinted. "Go on." "A document this old should be brittle, stained, falling apart. This one's barely aged, and the ink, it's too dark, too fresh." "Exactly." Iris leaned back against the desk, her arms crossed. "I noticed the same thing when Kane's lawyer brought it in, but without proof, there's nothing I can do." "So we get proof." How? Rhea thought for a moment, her mind racing. Then she said, the seal. If this is a forgery, the seal won't match the official records from that time period. Do you have access to those? Iris smiled, a thin, satisfied smile. As a matter of fact, I do. It took 3 hours of digging through dusty archives and cross-referencing documents, but finally they found it. The official county seal from 1847, stamped on a land grant for a property 20 miles south of Iron Hollow. Rhea held the two documents side by side, comparing the seals, and felt a surge of triumph. They're different, she said. The spacing is off. And the wording, look, the official seal says Silver Ridge County, but this one just says Silver Ridge. It's close, but it's not exact. Iris nodded slowly. That's enough to challenge the claim, but you'll need to present it to a judge, and Kane's going to fight you every step of the way. Then we fight back. It's not that simple. Kane's got influence. He could drag this out for months, maybe years. And in the meantime, Holt's ranch goes under. Rhea's jaw tightened. She knew Iris was right. Even with proof of forgery, Kane could tie them up in legal battles long enough to bleed the ranch dry. They needed something more. Something that would force Kane's hand before he had a chance to retaliate. Is there anything else? Rhea asked. Anything we can use? Iris hesitated, then pulled out another folder. There might be. A few months ago, a rancher named Tom Briggs filed a similar claim against Kane. Said Kane had falsified documents to seize part of his land. The case was dismissed. Briggs couldn't afford a good lawyer and Kane's legal team buried him, but the complaint's still on file. Where's Briggs now? Dead. Hart gave out last winter, but his widow's still around. Lives about 10 miles east of here. Rhea felt a cold weight settle in her gut. You think Kane's done this before? I think Kane's done a lot of things, Iris said quietly. And I think someone needs to stop him before he ruins any more lives. Rhea found the Briggs homestead just before sunset. It was a small, sagging structure that looked like it might collapse in a strong wind. The yard was overgrown, the fences broken, and the whole place had the air of abandonment. But smoke rose from the chimney, and when Rhea knocked on the door, a woman answered. She was in her 50s, thin and worn, with graying hair pulled back in a loose braid. Her eyes were wary, suspicious, and she held the door half closed like she was ready to slam it at a moment's notice. Mrs. Briggs? Who's asking? My name's Rhea Callahan. I'm working with a rancher named Darren Holt. We're trying to stop Garrett Kane from stealing his land, and I was hoping you could help us. The woman's expression hardened. I've got nothing to say about Kane. Please, I know what he did to your husband. I know he used forged documents, and I know that talking about it got my husband killed. Rhea blinked. Killed? Heart attack, they said. Convenient, wasn't it? Right after he filed that complaint. Mrs. Briggs's voice was bitter, brittle. Kane's got friends in this county, Miss Callahan. Friends who don't like people asking questions. So you're just going to let him get away with it? I'm going to keep my head down and stay alive. That's what I'm going to do. Rhea felt a flash of frustration, but she forced it down. She couldn't blame this woman for being scared. She'd lost her husband, her land, everything, and now a stranger was asking her to risk what little she had left. I understand, Rhea said quietly, and I'm sorry for bothering you. She turned to leave, but Mrs. Briggs's voice stopped her. Wait, Rhea looked back. The woman's face was tight, conflicted, but there was something else there too, something that looked like anger. There's a box, Mrs. Briggs said, in the barn. Tom kept all the documents from the case, the forged deed, the correspondence with Kane's lawyer, everything. He thought if he could gather enough evidence, he could take Kane down. Her voice broke. He was wrong. But maybe we won't be, Rhea said. Mrs. Briggs stared at her for a long moment. Then she nodded, just once. Barn's out back. Take what you need. But if anyone asks, you were never here. Rhea rode back to Iron Hollow with a saddlebag full of documents and a fire burning in her chest. She arrived late on the third day, exhausted and filthy, and found Darren waiting on the porch. He stood as she dismounted, his face tight with worry. You find anything? Rhea pulled the folder from her saddlebag and handed it to him. Kane's been doing this for years. Forged deeds, falsified claims. He's built half his empire on stolen land, and now we've got proof. Darren opened the folder, his eyes scanning the documents. His expression shifted from confusion to shock to cold, hard anger. This is enough to bury him. If we can get it in front of a judge, yeah, then that's what we do. But before they could say anything else, Luis came running from the barn, his face pale. Boss, we've got a problem. What now? It's Kane. He's at the creek, and he's got men with him. Rhea and Darren exchanged a look, and then they were running, sprinting across the yard toward the creek that cut through the northern edge of the property. By the time they reached it, a small crowd had gathered. Ranch hands, neighbors, even a few townspeople who'd heard the commotion. And there, standing in the middle of the creek with his boots in the water, was Garrett Kane. He had a surveyor with him, a thin man with a clipboard, and two armed men flanking him like guard dogs. Kane looked up as Darren approached, his face splitting into a cold smile. Holt, good of you to join us. Get off my land. Your land, Kane gestured to the creek. According to the county records, this water belongs to me, which means you're trespassing. That deed's a fake, and you know it. Kane's smile widened. Prove it. Darren's hand went to the folder tucked under his arm, but Rhea caught his wrist. Not yet, she murmured. Not like this. Then when? In court. Where it'll matter. Kane must have seen the exchange because his expression shifted, just slightly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. You got something to say, Holt? Darren met his eyes, and when he spoke, his voice was steady. Yeah, I'll see you in front of a judge. Kane's jaw tightened, and for a moment Rhea thought he might say something else. But then he turned and strode back to his horse, his men following. As he rode away, he called over his shoulder. Enjoy the water while you can, Holt. It won't be yours much longer. Rhea watched him go, her hands clenched into fists. And then she turned to Darren and said, We're running out of time. I know. So we move fast. We file the complaint, get an emergency hearing, and we hit him before he knows what's coming. Darren nodded slowly. And if it doesn't work? Rhea looked back at the corral, where Vortex stood watching them, his dark eyes steady. Then we fight anyway. The courthouse in Silver Ridge was a 2-story brick building that had seen better decades. Paint peeled from the window frames, and the steps leading to the entrance sagged in the middle like a swayback horse. Rhea stood on those steps 3 days later, the folder of documents clutched tight against her chest, and tried not to think about all the ways this could go wrong. Darren stood beside her, clean-shaven, and wearing what was probably his only good shirt. Luis and Red had come along too, standing a few paces back, their hats in their hands. Even Maggie was there, holding tight to her father's hand, her face solemn. You ready? Darren asked. Rhea's stomach was tied in knots, but she nodded. As I'll ever be. They climbed the steps and pushed through the heavy wooden doors into the cool dimness of the courthouse. The interior smelled of old paper and floor wax, and their boots echoed on the marble floor as they made their way to the clerk's office. Iris was waiting for them, her expression grim but determined. Judge Hawthorne agreed to an emergency hearing, she said, leading them down a narrow hallway. But Kane's already here with his lawyers. They're not happy about this. Good, Rhea muttered. The courtroom was smaller than Rhea had expected, with rows of wooden benches and a raised platform where the judge would sit. Garrett Kane was already there, seated at a table with 2 men in expensive suits. He looked up as they entered, his eyes narrowing, and Rhea saw the flash of anger cross his face before he smoothed it into a smirk. Holt, he said, his voice carrying across the room. Didn't think you had it in you. Darren didn't respond. He just took his seat at the opposite table, Rhea settling in beside him. Maggie squeezed into the bench behind them, her eyes wide and worried. Judge Hawthorne entered a few minutes later, a heavy-set man with a gray beard and eyes that looked like they'd seen every kind of human foolishness there was. He settled into his chair with a grunt and banged his gavel once. All right, let's get this over with. Mr. Kane, you filed a claim on the water rights to Black Creek based on a deed allegedly dating back to 1847. Mr. Holt, you're contesting that claim on the grounds of forgery. That about sum it up? Yes, Your Honor, one of Kane's lawyers said, rising smoothly. His name was Whitman, and he had the kind of polished confidence that came from winning more cases than he'd lost. But I'd like to point out that Mr. Holt has provided no evidence to support his accusation. The deed in question has been authenticated by county records. Authenticated by who? Rhea interrupted, standing up. Whitman turned to look at her, his eyebrows raised. I'm sorry, who are you? Rhea Callahan. I'm the one who found the evidence. Judge Hawthorne leaned forward. And what evidence would that be, Miss Callahan? Rhea opened the folder and pulled out the documents she'd gathered. The comparison of the seals, the records from the Briggs case, the correspondence proving Kane had used the same tactics before. She laid them out on the table, her hand steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The seal on Kane's deed doesn't match the official county seal from 1847. The spacing is wrong, the wording's different, and the paper's too clean for a document that's supposed to be nearly 80 years old. And this isn't the first time Kane's pulled this trick. 3 years ago, he used a forged deed to seize land from a man named Tom Briggs. The complaint was dismissed, but the documentation's all here. Whitman's expression didn't change, but Rhea saw the way his jaw tightened. Your Honor, this is speculation, without expert testimony. Then let's get an expert, Judge Hawthorne said, turning to Iris. Miss Garrett, you've been the county clerk for how long? 32 years, Your Honor. And in your professional opinion, do these seals match? Iris stepped forward, her spine straight, and examined the documents. After a long moment, she shook her head. No, Your Honor, they don't. The courtroom went dead silent. Rhea could feel Kane's eyes boring into the side of her head, but she didn't look at him. She kept her gaze fixed on the judge. Hawthorne leaned back in his chair, stroking his beard. Mr. Kane, you got anything to say about this? Kane stood, his face flushed with anger. This is ridiculous. That clerk's a friend of the Holts. Of course she's going to back them up. You can't take her word over authenticated county records. Actually, I can, Hawthorne said mildly, especially when those records don't add up. Miss Garrett's been working in that office longer than you've been alive, Kane, and her reputation's spotless. Yours, on the other hand. He let the sentence hang. Whitman stood quickly. Your Honor, we request a continuance. Give us time to— Request denied. Hawthorne banged his gavel. The claim on Black Creek is dismissed. Water rights remain with the Holt family, as they have for the past 40 years. And Mr. Kane, if I ever see you in my courtroom with another one of these fake deeds, I'll have you charged with fraud. We clear? Kane's face went from red to white, his hands clenched into fists. For a moment, Rhea thought he might actually lunge across the room. But then Whitman put a hand on his shoulder, murmuring something too low to hear, and Kane turned and strode out of the courtroom without another word. Rhea let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Beside her, Darren slumped in his chair, his face in his hands. We did it, Rhea said quietly. Yeah, Darren said, his voice muffled. We did. Maggie threw her arms around her father's neck, tears streaming down her face. And for the first time since Rhea had arrived at Iron Hollow, she saw Darren Holt smile. It was a small, fragile thing, but it was real. Behind them, Louise clapped Red on the shoulder. Drinks are on me when we get back. Hell yes, Red said, grinning. Iris walked over, her expression softer than Rhea had ever seen it. You did good work, Miss Callahan. Not many people would have gone up against Kane like that. I had help, Rhea said, glancing at Darren. Well, you've got a friend here now. Anything you need, you come find me. Rhea shook her hand, feeling the weight of the moment settle over her. They'd won. Against all odds, against Kane's money and power and influence, they'd actually won. But as they left the courthouse and stepped out into the bright afternoon sunlight, Rhea couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Not yet. The ride back to Iron Hollow took most of the day, and by the time they arrived, the sun was dipping low on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Rhea dismounted in the yard, her body aching from hours in the saddle, and headed straight for the corral. Vortex was waiting for her, his dark eyes fixed on her as she approached. He walked over to the fence, pressing his nose against her chest, and Rhea wrapped her arms around his neck, breathing in the smell of him, dust and sweat, and something wild that couldn't be named. We did it, she murmured. The ranch is safe. The stallion exhaled warm breath against her jacket, and for a moment, everything else fell away. The courtroom, Kane, the fear that had been gnawing at her for weeks, all of it vanished, leaving just this, her and the horse, standing together in the fading light. You gonna ride him? Rhea turned. Darren was leaning against the fence, his arms crossed, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Soon," she said. "How soon?" Rhea looked back at Vortex, at the way he was standing, relaxed, calm, his weight shifted onto one hip. "Tomorrow, maybe. If he's ready. And if he's not, then I'll wait." Darren was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You know, when you first showed up here, I thought you were crazy, thought you'd last maybe a week before you packed up and left. And now? Now I think you might be the best thing that's happened to this place in a long time." Rhea felt her chest tighten. "Darren, I mean it." He pushed off the fence, taking a step closer. "You saved the ranch, Rhea. You saved all of us. And I don't know how to thank you for that." "You don't have to thank me." "Yeah, I do." His voice was rough, edged with something that sounded like emotion. "You didn't have to do any of this. You could have walked away at any point, but you didn't. You stayed. And I need you to know that means something." Rhea didn't know what to say to that, so she just nodded. Darren held her gaze for a moment longer, and then he turned and walked back toward the house, his shoulders a little straighter than they'd been before. Luis appeared a few minutes later, a bottle of whiskey in one hand and a grin on his face. "Come on, we're celebrating. Even Red's gonna have a drink, and that man doesn't drink anything stronger than milk." Rhea laughed despite herself. "I'll be there in a minute. Don't take too long. This bottle won't last forever." He wandered off, and Rhea turned back to Vortex. The stallion was watching her, his ears pricked forward, and she could have sworn there was something knowing in his eyes. "What do you think?" she asked softly. "You ready to trust me all the way?" Vortex snorted and tossed his head, and Rhea took that as a yes. Oh, she woke before dawn the next morning, her nerves humming with anticipation. The bunkhouse was quiet, Luis and Red still snoring in their cots, and Rhea slipped out without waking them. The air was cold and sharp, the sky just beginning to lighten in the east, and her breath misted in front of her as she walked to the barn. Vortex was awake, standing in the center of the corral, his head up and his ears swiveling toward her. Rhea grabbed the saddle and bridle from the tack room and carried them over, moving slow and deliberate. The stallion watched her, his muscles tense but not panicked, and when she opened the gate and stepped inside, he didn't bolt. "Morning," Rhea said softly. "You ready for this?" Vortex took a step forward, then another, and pressed his nose against her shoulder. Rhea ran her hand along his neck, feeling the warmth of him, the steady rhythm of his breathing. She'd done this 100 times before, saddled horses, bridled them, ridden them into submission or partnership, but this felt different. This felt like something more. She worked the saddle onto his back, cinching it slowly, and Vortex stood still, his weight shifting but his hooves planted. Then came the bridle, the bit sliding between his teeth, the leather straps settling over his ears. He shook his head once, testing the feel of it, but he didn't fight. "Good boy," Rhea murmured. "You're doing so good." She led him around the corral a few times, letting him get used to the weight of the saddle, the pull of the reins. And then, when she felt the moment was right, she put her foot in the stirrup and swung up into the saddle. For a split second, nothing happened. And then Vortex exploded. He bucked hard, his back arching like a bow, and Rhea felt herself lifted out of the saddle. Her hands clenched tight on the reins, her legs clamping down, and she rode the motion, her body moving with the horse instead of against him. Vortex twisted, landing hard on his front hooves, and bucked again, his hind legs kicking out with enough force to shatter bone. Rhea stayed on. She didn't try to force him into submission, didn't yank on the reins or dig her heels into his sides. She just moved with him, her body loose and fluid, letting him burn through the panic and rage until there was nothing left but exhaustion. And then, slowly, impossibly, Vortex stopped bucking. He stood in the center of the corral, his sides heaving, his coat dark with sweat. Rhea sat still in the saddle, her own heart pounding, her hands trembling. She reached down and ran her hand along his neck, feeling the tension in his muscles, the wild energy still coiled beneath his skin. "You're all right," she said softly. "You're all right." Vortex's ears flicked back toward her, and after a moment, he took a tentative step forward. Then another. And then he was walking, slow and steady, his head lowered, his breathing starting to even out. Rhea felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back. She'd done it. After 6 weeks of patience and persistence and sheer stubborn will, she'd done it. A slow clap echoed across the yard, and Rhea looked up to see Darren standing at the fence, Maggie beside him. Luis and Red were there too, both of them grinning like fools. "Hell of a ride," Luis called out. "Damn right," Red added. Darren didn't say anything, but the look on his face said it all. Pride. Relief. Goal. Something that looked almost like hope. Rhea dismounted, her legs shaky, and Vortex pressed his nose against her chest. She wrapped her arms around his neck and closed her eyes, feeling the solid reality of him, the trust they'd built together. "We're not done yet," she whispered. "But we're getting there." The next few days passed in a blur of work and exhaustion. Rhea rode Vortex every morning, pushing him a little further each time, teaching him to respond to her cues, to trust her weight in the saddle. It wasn't easy. There were still moments when he'd spook at a shadow or a sound, when he'd buck or shy and Rhea would have to talk him down. But those moments grew fewer and farther between, and by the end of the week she could ride him across the ranch without incident. The hands stopped making jokes. Now they just watched, shaking their heads in disbelief, as Rhea guided the stallion through the pastures, over the low hills, around the cattle. Even Darren seemed impressed, though he tried not to show it. "You've got a gift," he said one evening as they stood on the porch, watching the sun set over the hills. "It's not a gift," Rhea said. "It's just patience." "Well, whatever it is, I'm glad you've got it." Rhea glanced at him. There was something different in his voice tonight, something softer. "You doing all right?" Darren was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Maggie asked about you today. Wanted to know if you were going to stay." "What'd you tell her?" "I told her I didn't know." He looked at Rhea, his eyes steady. "But I'd like it if you did." Rhea's chest tightened. She hadn't thought about staying, not really. She'd come to Iron Hollow to work with a horse, to prove something to herself. And now that she'd done it, she'd figured she'd move on. That's what she always did. But standing here, looking at Darren, at the ranch stretching out behind him, she found herself hesitating. "I'll think about it," she said finally. Darren nodded. "That's all I'm asking." 2 days later, everything went to hell. Rhea was in the barn, grooming Vortex, when Luis came running in, his face pale and his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Boss, we got a problem." Darren looked up from where he was mending a harness. "What now?" "Kane, he's blocking the road into town. Won't let anyone through." Rhea felt her blood go cold. "What do you mean, blocking the road?" "I mean, he's got men and wagons set up across the main road, and he's turning everyone back. Says nobody from this ranch is getting through until Holt pays him for damages." Darren's jaw tightened. "Damages for what?" "Hell if I know, but he's not backing down." Rhea exchanged a look with Darren, and she could see the same thought running through his mind. Kane wasn't going to let this go. He'd lost in court, lost his claim on the water, and now he was looking for revenge. "We need to get into town," Darren said. "We're low on supplies, and Doc Miller's supposed to be coming out to check on one of the horses." "If Kane keeps that road blocked, then we find another way in," Rhea said. "There is no other way. Not unless you want to go through the canyon, and that's a death trap even in good weather." Rhea looked out the barn door toward the hills that ringed the ranch. The canyon Darren was talking about cut through the northern range, a narrow passage carved by centuries of flash floods. It was treacherous, unstable, and no one in their right mind would risk riding through it. But they didn't have a choice. "How long would it take?" Rhea asked. Darren stared at her. "You can't be serious. How long?" 4 hours, maybe 5, but Rhea, that canyon's a nightmare. One wrong step and you're over the edge, and if it rains, then we better hope it doesn't rain. I'm not letting you do this. You're not letting me do anything. I'm doing it because we need those supplies, and because Kane doesn't get to hold this ranch hostage. Rhea turned to face him fully, her eyes blazing. "You said yourself we're running low. We can wait him out and risk losing cattle, or we can take a chance and get what we need. So what's it going to be?" Darren opened his mouth, closed it, and then cursed under his breath. "You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met." "I'll take that as a compliment." "It's not." But there was no heat in his voice, just resignation. "All right. But you're not going alone. I'm coming with you." "No, you're not. You're needed here." Rhea, Darren, listen to me. If something happens to you, this ranch falls apart. Maggie needs you. The hands need you. But me? She shrugged. I'm expendable. That's not true.
It is, and you know it. Rhea turned back to Vortex, running her hand along his neck. Besides, I've got the best horse on the ranch. If anyone can make it through that canyon, it's us. Darren looked like he wanted to argue, but he didn't. He just stood there, his hands clenched into fists, his face tight with worry. Finally, he said, "At least take Red with you. Red can't ride well enough for terrain like that." Then Luis.
Luis has a family. I'm not putting him at risk. Rhea swung up into the saddle, settling her weight, and Vortex shifted beneath her, steady and strong. I'll be back before dark. And if I'm not, don't come looking for me. Just keep the ranch running. Rhea. But she was already riding out, Vortex's hooves kicking up dust as they headed toward the northern hills. Behind her, she heard Darren shout her name, but she didn't look back. Couldn't look back. If she did, she might lose her nerve. The canyon entrance was a jagged split in the rock face, narrow and shadowed, with walls that rose 100 feet on either side. Rhea dismounted and led Vortex through on foot, her boots slipping on the loose scree, her eyes scanning the path ahead. The air was cooler here, damp with the smell of wet stone, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the faint trickle of water. The canyon floor was uneven, littered with boulders and debris from past floods. Rhea picked her way carefully, testing each step before committing her weight, and Vortex followed close behind, his breath warm on the back of her neck. They'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes when Rhea heard it, the low rumble of thunder, distant but unmistakable. She looked up. The sky above the canyon was still blue, but to the west, dark clouds were gathering, piling up like bruises against the horizon. Rhea's stomach clenched. If it rained while they were in the canyon, they'd be trapped. Flash floods moved fast in terrain like this, faster than a horse could run, and there'd be no way out. Come on, she muttered, remounting. We need to move. Vortex didn't need encouragement. He could feel the tension in her body, the urgency in her movements, and he broke into a trot, his hooves clattering on the stone. They moved deeper into the canyon, the walls closing in around them, the light growing dimmer. Rhea kept her eyes on the path, her heart pounding, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The first drops of rain hit her face halfway through. It started as a sprinkle, light and almost gentle, but within minutes it became a downpour. Water sheeted off the canyon walls, turning the ground slick and treacherous, and Rhea felt Vortex's hooves slip more than once. She leaned forward in the saddle, her hands tight on the reins, and urged him faster. And then she heard it, the roar. It started low, like distant thunder, but it grew louder with every passing second. Rhea twisted in the saddle, looking back, and her blood turned to ice. A wall of water was surging through the canyon behind them, churning with debris. Branches, rocks, entire trees, moving with terrifying speed. Run! Rhea shouted, digging her heels into Vortex's sides. The stallion lunged forward, his muscles bunching and releasing, his hooves pounding against the stone. Rhea leaned low over his neck, her face pressed against his mane, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. The roar grew louder, closer, and she could feel the spray of water on her back, cold and stinging. The canyon narrowed ahead, the walls pinching together, and Rhea saw the way out, a steep, rocky slope that climbed up and out of the flood path. But it was 50 yards away, maybe more, and the water was gaining on them. Come on, boy, Rhea gasped. Come on! Vortex ran like he'd been born for this, his strides long and powerful, his breath coming in harsh snorts. The water was at their heels now, close enough that Rhea could hear the crash of debris slamming into the canyon walls. And then, with a final burst of speed, Vortex reached the slope and lunged upward. His hooves scrabbled on the wet rock, slipping, sliding, but he didn't stop. He clawed his way up, inch by inch, his muscles straining, his breath ragged. Rhea clung to the saddle, her knuckles white, her legs clamped tight around his sides. Behind them, the flood roared past, a churning torrent of destruction, missing them by mere feet. And then they were out. Vortex stumbled onto level ground, his legs shaking, his sides heaving. Rhea slid out of the saddle and collapsed onto her hands and knees, gasping for air, her whole body trembling. For a long moment, neither of them moved. They just stood there, alive, soaked to the bone, staring at the canyon that had nearly killed them. We made it, Rhea whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. We actually made it. Vortex lowered his head, pressing his nose against her shoulder, and Rhea wrapped her arms around his neck, holding on like he was the only solid thing left in the world. They'd survived. Against all odds, through sheer will and trust and a bond that went deeper than words, they'd survived. And in that moment, standing on the edge of the canyon with the storm raging behind them, Rhea knew she'd never leave this place. Not willingly. Not ever. It took Rhea another hour to reach town, riding through mud and rain that didn't let up until she was halfway down Main Street. By the time she tied Vortex to the hitching post outside the general store, both of them looked like they'd been dragged through hell backwards. Her clothes clung to her skin, her hair plastered to her face, and Vortex's coat was streaked with mud and foam. People stared as she dismounted, some with curiosity, others with something that looked like awe. The storekeeper, a round man named Horace with spectacles that sat crooked on his nose, came out onto the porch, his eyes widening when he saw her. "Miss Callahan? What in blazes?" "Need supplies," Rhea said, her voice hoarse. "Everything on Darren Holt's list, plus whatever medical kit you've got, and grain for the horse." Horace blinked. "You came through the canyon?" "Didn't have much choice. Kane's got the main road blocked. I heard about that." "Fool thing to do, but Kane's been making a lot of fool decisions lately." Horace disappeared into the store, muttering to himself, and returned a few minutes later with a bag of grain. "Let me get your horse settled first. He looks about done in." Rhea led Vortex around to the small stable behind the store, her legs shaking with exhaustion. Horace filled a trough with water and dumped the grain into a bucket, and Vortex buried his nose in it, eating with the single-minded focus of an animal that had earned every bite. Rhea ran her hand along his neck, feeling the tremor in his muscles, the heat radiating off his skin. "You did good," she murmured. "Better than good. You saved both our lives." The stallion's ear flicked toward her, but he didn't stop eating. Rhea smiled despite herself and headed back into the store where Horace was already piling supplies on the counter: flour, sugar, coffee, salt pork, canned goods, a bottle of whiskey, and a battered tin box that turned out to be the medical kit. "This everything?" Rhea asked. "Close enough. Doc Miller's supplies came in yesterday, so I threw in some bandages and antiseptic. Figured you might need it after that ride. Appreciate it." Rhea pulled out the money Darren had given her and counted it onto the counter. It wasn't much, but it was enough to cover the basics with a little left over. Horace swept the bills into his drawer and started loading everything into a canvas sack. "You planning to go back the same way?" "Don't see that I've got a choice. Canyon's gonna be a mess after that flood. Could be blocked entirely. Then I'll find a way around." Horace shook his head, but there was something like respect in his eyes. "You're either the bravest woman I've ever met, or the craziest." "Probably both," Rhea said, slinging the sack over her shoulder. She was halfway out the door when Horace called after her. "Hey, Miss Callahan. Word is Kane's talking about filing charges against you and Holt. Says you stole documents from the county office." Rhea turned back, her jaw tightening. "That's a lie. Maybe. But Kane's got friends. And they're listening. Just thought you should know." Rhea nodded once and stepped back out into the rain, which had softened to a drizzle. She loaded the supplies onto Vortex, tying them down with rope, and then swung up into the saddle. The stallion shifted beneath her, tired but steady, and they started back toward the canyon. The return trip was worse than the first. The flood had scoured the canyon floor, leaving behind a jumbled mess of rocks and debris. Twice, Rhea had to dismount and lead Vortex over sections where the path had collapsed entirely, her boots slipping on wet stone, her hands raw from gripping the reins. The rain started up again, not as heavy as before, but relentless, and by the time they finally emerged from the canyon, the sun was setting and Rhea was so exhausted she could barely sit upright. She rode into the ranch yard just as the last light faded from the sky, and Darren came running out of the house, his face pale with worry. "Where the hell have you been? I was about to ride out looking for you." "Canyon flooded," Rhea said, dismounting with a grunt. Her legs nearly buckled, and Darren caught her arm, steadying her. "Had to wait for the water to go down before I could get back through." "You could have been killed, but I wasn't." Rhea handed him the sack of supplies. "Got everything on the list, plus a little extra." Darren stared at her, his jaw working like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Finally, he just shook his head and pulled her into a rough, one-armed hug. "You're insane, you know that?" "So I've been told." Luis came jogging over, red behind him, and they took charge of Vortex, leading him toward the barn. Maggie appeared on the porch, her face lighting up when she saw Rhea. "You're back." "I'm back," Rhea said, managing a tired smile. "Papa said you went through the canyon. He said it was dangerous." "It was, but we made it." Maggie threw her arms around Rhea's waist, squeezing tight, and Rhea felt something in her chest crack open. She hadn't realized how much this place, these people, had come to mean to her until this exact moment. Standing here, muddy and exhausted and half-drowned, she felt more at home than she had in years. Darren cleared his throat. "Come on. You need to get dry and eat something before you fall over." Rhea followed him into the house, stripping off her wet jacket and hanging it by the fire. Darren handed her a towel and a cup of coffee that was strong enough to strip paint, and she sank into a chair at the kitchen table, feeling the warmth seep back into her bones. Maggie hovered nearby, chattering about her day, and Darren moved around the kitchen, heating up leftover stew and slicing bread. It was comfortable. Easy. And for the first time since she'd arrived at Iron Hollow, Rhea let herself imagine what it might be like to stay. But the moment didn't last. There was a knock at the door, hard, insistent, and Darren's expression darkened. He crossed to the door and yanked it open, and Rhea's stomach sank when she saw who was standing there. Sheriff Tom Garrett was a stocky man with a gut that hung over his belt and a face like weathered leather. He stood on the porch with his hat in his hands, looking uncomfortable, and behind him were two deputies, both armed. "Darren," the sheriff said, "we need to talk." "About what?" "About Miss Callahan." The sheriff's eyes flicked toward Rhea. "I've got a warrant for her arrest." The room went dead silent. Rhea felt the blood drain from her face, but she forced herself to stay calm. "On what charge?" "Theft of county property. Garrett Kane filed a complaint, says you stole documents from the records office in Silver Ridge." "That's a damn lie," Darren said, his voice hard. "Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but I've got a warrant and I've got to bring her in." The sheriff looked at Rhea, and there was something apologetic in his eyes. "I'm sorry, Miss Callahan. I don't want to do this, but Kane's got the judge in his pocket, and my hands are tied." Rhea stood slowly, her mind racing. She could run, grab Vortex, and ride out before the sheriff could stop her, but that would make her look guilty, and it would put Darren and the ranch in even more danger. No, the only way through this was to face it head on. "All right," she said quietly. "Let's go." "Rhea, no." Darren started, but she cut him off. "It's fine. I didn't steal anything, and we can prove it." Kane's not going to let it go that easy. "I know, but running won't solve anything." She turned to the sheriff. "Can I at least get dry clothes first?" Garrett hesitated, then nodded. 5 minutes. Rhea went to the bunkhouse, changed into dry jeans and a clean shirt, and then walked back out to where the sheriff was waiting. Darren stood on the porch, his fists clenched, his face tight with anger. Maggie was crying, clinging to her father's leg, and Rhea felt her resolve waver. "Take care of Vortex," she said to Darren, "and don't do anything stupid." "You're the one doing something stupid." "Maybe." Rhea gave him a small, sad smile. "But it's my choice." The ride to Silver Ridge took most of the night. Rhea sat on her horse, flanked by the deputies, and tried not to think about what was waiting for her. The jail was a small, squat building on the edge of town, with 2 cells and a desk that looked like it had been carved out of a single piece of wood. The sheriff locked her in the first cell, his expression grim, and then left without another word. Rhea sat on the narrow cot and stared at the ceiling, her mind churning. Kane had made his move, and it was a smart one. Even if she could prove the theft charges were false, he could drag the case out for weeks, maybe months. And in the meantime, she'd be stuck here, unable to help Darren, unable to work with Vortex. She must have dozed off at some point, because the next thing she knew, sunlight was streaming through the barred window and someone was unlocking the cell door. Rhea sat up, blinking, and saw Iris standing there, her face set in a determined scowl. "Come on," the older woman said. "We're getting you out of here." Don't ask questions, just move." Rhea followed Iris out of the cell and through the sheriff's office, where Garrett was sitting at his desk, looking like he'd aged 10 years overnight. "She's free to go," he said without looking up. "Charges were dropped." "Dropped?"
Rhea stared at him. Why?
Because I told Judge Hawthorne exactly what Kane was trying to pull, and Hawthorne doesn't like being used. Iris's voice was sharp, triumphant. Kane filed a false complaint based on fabricated evidence, and the judge made it clear that if he tries this again, he'll be the one sitting in a cell. Rhea felt a wave of relief so intense it made her knees weak. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Kane's not done. He's lost twice now, and men like him don't take losing well. Iris handed her a folded piece of paper. This came for you this morning. Courier brought it from Iron Hollow. Rhea unfolded the paper, her heart sinking as she read the message scrawled in Darren's handwriting. Kane's men are at the ranch. Come back. Now. She didn't wait for Iris to say anything else. She just ran. Her mare was still tied outside the sheriff's office, and Rhea swung up into the saddle, spurring the animal into a gallop before her boots were fully in the stirrups. The ride back to Iron Hollow was a blur of dust and pounding hooves, her mind racing faster than the horse beneath her. Kane had waited until she was out of the way, and now he was making his move. If she didn't get back in time, she didn't let herself finish that thought. By the time she reached the ranch, the sun was high overhead, and the scene that greeted her made her blood run cold. Kane was there, along with Bull and Clyde and half a dozen other men, all of them armed. They'd cornered Darren, Luis, and Red near the barn, and Maggie was standing on the porch, her face pale and tear-streaked. Vortex was in the corral, pacing frantically, his head high and his eyes rolling. One of Kane's men, Bull, was holding a rope, and Rhea realized with a jolt of horror what they were planning. She rode straight into the middle of the standoff, her mare skidding to a halt in the dust. Get off this property, now! Kane turned, his face splitting into a cold smile. Well, well, the horse whisperer returns. I heard they let you out of jail. Shame that. What are you doing here? Collecting what's owed to me. Since Holt can't pay his debts, I'm taking the horse. Like hell you are. Rhea dismounted, her hand going to the knife at her belt. That horse isn't yours and you know it. Actually, he is. See, I've got a lien on this property. Filed it last week. And according to the bank, Holt's 3 months behind on his mortgage. So everything on this ranch, including that stallion, belongs to me now. Rhea looked at Darren, who was staring at the ground, his face ashen. Darren? It's true, he said quietly. I didn't want to tell you. Thought I could figure something out, but... His voice trailed off. Rhea felt the world tilt beneath her. All of this, the trial, the ride through the canyon, the arrest, it had all been a distraction. Kane had been playing a longer game, and now he had them exactly where he wanted them. You can't do this, she said, turning back to Kane. I can, and I am. Now step aside or I'll have my men move you. Bull stepped forward, the rope in his hands, and started toward the corral. Vortex saw him coming and reared, his hooves slashing the air, his scream echoing across the ranch. The stallion slammed into the fence, splintering one of the posts, and Bull stumbled back, his face pale. That horse is a menace, Kane said, but he'll fetch a good price once he's broken proper. You're not breaking him, Rhea said, her voice shaking with fury. You're not even touching him. And who's going to stop me? You? Kane laughed. You're just a drifter, Callahan. You've got no claim here, no rights, so do yourself a favor and walk away. Rhea stared at him, her mind racing. She could fight, throw herself at Kane and his men, and hope for the best. But she was outnumbered and outgunned, and Darren and the others would just get hurt trying to protect her. There had to be another way. There had to be... And then it hit her. The race, she said. Kane frowned. What? The Frontier Run. It's next week, isn't it? Rhea's heart was pounding, but her voice was steady. Winner takes home $1,000, enough to pay off Darren's mortgage and then some. So? So I'll make you a deal. You give us 1 week, just 1 week, to come up with the money. If we can't, the ranch is yours. But if we can, you walk away and leave us alone, for good. Kane's eyes narrowed. And why would I agree to that? Because you're a gambling man, Kane. I can see it in you, and I'm offering you a bet you can't lose. Either you get the ranch now, or you get it in a week. What's the difference? Kane was quiet for a long moment, his gaze flicking between Rhea and the corral, where Vortex was still pacing. Finally, he smiled, a slow, predatory thing. All right, you've got your week. But when you lose, I want that stallion too. Not just the ranch, the horse.
Rhea felt her stomach drop, but she didn't let it show. Fine. Rhea, no. Darren started, but she cut him off with a look. It's done, she said. Kane tipped his hat, his smile widening. See you at the starting line, Miss Callahan. Try not to get yourself killed before then. He turned and strode back to his horse, his men following. They rode out in a cloud of dust, and the ranch fell silent. Darren grabbed Rhea's arm, spinning her around. What the hell were you thinking? You can't race in the frontier run. It's 20 miles of the roughest terrain in the county, and half the riders don't even finish. I don't have a choice. Yes, you do. We can fight this in court. We can... There's no time, Darren. You heard him. He's got a lien, he's got the bank on his side, and he's not going to stop until he's taken everything. Rhea pulled her arm free, her eyes blazing. This is the only way. And if you lose, if you get hurt, or worse, then at least I went down fighting. Darren stared at her, his face a mix of anger and fear and something else she couldn't quite name. Finally, he said, You're really going to do this? Yeah, I am. Then I'm helping. Darren, no arguments. If you're racing, you're going to need every advantage you can get. And that means training, hard. He looked at Luis and Red, who were standing nearby, their faces grim. You two are in on this too. We've got 1 week to get Rhea and that horse ready, and we're not wasting a second of it. Luis nodded. You got it, boss. Red just grinned. About time things got interesting around here. Rhea felt her throat tighten. She wanted to argue, to tell them they didn't have to do this, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she just nodded, her eyes stinging with tears she refused to shed. Maggie ran down from the porch and threw her arms around Rhea's waist. You're going to win, she said fiercely. I know you are. Rhea crouched down, looking the girl in the eye. I'm going to try, kid. That's all I can promise. That's enough. Rhea stood, her resolve hardening. 1 week. That's all they had. 1 week to train, to prepare, to turn a wild stallion into a racehorse and herself into a rider good enough to win. It wasn't much time, but it would have to be enough. The next 7 days were the hardest of Rhea's life. She woke before dawn every morning and rode Vortex until they were both soaked with sweat and trembling with exhaustion. Darren mapped out a training course that mimicked the race terrain, steep hills, rocky trails, narrow passages that required precision and trust. Luis timed their runs, shouting encouragement and criticism in equal measure, and Red worked on Vortex's stamina, pushing him harder and further each day. Rhea's body ached in ways she'd never experienced. Her thighs were raw from hours in the saddle, her hands blistered from gripping the reins, and every muscle screamed in protest when she woke each morning. But she didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Vortex, for his part, seemed to understand what was at stake. He ran like his life depended on it, his strides lengthening, his breathing evening out, his trust in Rhea growing with every mile. By the 5th day, they were moving as one. Not horse and rider, but a single entity, fluid and fast and unstoppable. On the 6th day, Darren pulled her aside. You're ready. You sure? As sure as I can be. You and that horse. You've got something I've never seen before. If anyone can win this, it's you. Rhea wanted to believe him. She needed to believe him. But the doubt gnawed at her, whispering in the back of her mind that she was in over her head, that she was going to fail, that she was going to lose everything. That night, she couldn't sleep. She slipped out of the bunkhouse and walked to the corral, where Vortex was standing in the moonlight. The stallion walked over to her, pressing his nose against her chest, and Rhea wrapped her arms around his neck. Tomorrow's it, she whispered. Win or lose, this is what we trained for. So I need you to trust me one more time, just one more time. Vortex exhaled warm breath against her jacket, and Rhea closed her eyes. Whatever happened tomorrow, at least she'd know she'd given it everything she had. And sometimes that was all you could do. The morning of the race dawned cold and clear, the kind of day where the air cut through your lungs and made every breath feel sharp. Rhea stood in the corral with Vortex, running her hands over his legs, checking for any sign of strain or injury. The stallion was calm, almost eerily so, his dark eyes watching her with an intensity that made her chest tighten. You feel that? She murmured. That's everyone watching us, waiting to see if we fail. Vortex snorted and tossed his head, and Rhea allowed herself a small smile. Yeah, I know.
We're not going to give them the satisfaction. Darren appeared at the fence, holding a cup of coffee that steamed in the cold air. His face was drawn, shadows under his eyes that spoke of a sleepless night. You eat anything? Not hungry. Eat anyway. You'll need the energy. Rhea took the coffee, but left the biscuit he offered on the fence post. Her stomach was tied in knots, and the thought of food made her nauseous. She'd faced dangerous horses before, ridden through storms and rough terrain, but this was different. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about Darren, Maggie, Luis, Red, and every person who'd put their faith in her. If she lost, they lost everything. Luis and Red emerged from the barn, leading Rhea's mare. They'd decided she'd ride the mare to the starting line and switch to Vortex there, saving the stallion's energy for the race itself. It was a smart strategy, but it meant Rhea would have only moments to settle into the saddle before the gun fired. Weather's good, Luis said, glancing at the sky. No rain forecast. That's something. Kane's gonna be there, Red added. Heard he's riding that chestnut gelding of his. Fast horse, mean rider. Rhea nodded. She'd expected as much. Kane wouldn't leave this to chance. He'd be in the race himself, doing everything he could to make sure she didn't win, which meant she'd have to outrun him, outthink him, and outlast him over 20 brutal miles. Maggie came running from the house, her braids flying behind her. She was carrying something wrapped in cloth, and when she reached Rhea, she held it out with both hands. I made this for you, for luck. Rhea unwrapped the cloth and found a small braided bracelet made from horsehair, black, from Vortex's mane. It was rough and uneven, the work of a child's hands, but it was also one of the most beautiful things Rhea had ever seen. She slipped it onto her wrist, her throat tight. Thank you, kid. I'll keep it safe. You better win, Maggie said fiercely, because if you don't, I'm going to be really mad. Rhea crouched down and pulled the girl into a hug. I'll do my best. That's all I can promise. Your best is pretty good, Maggie whispered. Darren cleared his throat, and when Rhea looked up, his eyes were suspiciously bright. We should get moving. Race starts in an hour. The ride to the starting line took 30 minutes, and by the time they arrived, a crowd had already gathered. The Frontier Run was one of the biggest events in the county, drawing riders from all over, ranchers, drifters, professional racers, anyone who thought they had what it took to survive 20 miles of hell. The starting area was a wide clearing on the edge of town, with a painted line marking the beginning of the course and flags strung up to mark the way forward. Rhea dismounted and led her mare to the side, her eyes scanning the crowd. She spotted Kane almost immediately. He was standing near his chestnut gelding, surrounded by Bull and Clyde and a handful of other men who looked like they'd been pulled straight from a wanted poster. Kane's gaze locked onto hers, and he smiled, cold and predatory. Miss Callahan, he called out, loud enough for half the crowd to hear. Glad you could make it. Wouldn't want you to miss your own funeral. Rhea ignored him and turned to Darren, who was already leading Vortex over. The stallion's ears were pinned back, his nostrils flaring as he took in the noise and chaos. Rhea ran her hand along his neck, murmuring soft reassurances, and felt some of the tension ease out of him. You've got this, Darren said quietly. Just remember, it's not about being the fastest. It's about being the smartest. Pace yourself, conserve his energy, and don't let Kane goad you into doing something stupid. Easier said than done. I know. But you're not stupid, Rhea. You're one of the smartest people I've ever met, so trust yourself as much as that horse trusts you. Rhea looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the fear and hope warring in his expression. She wanted to say something, thank you maybe, or I'm sorry for dragging you into this, but the words stuck in her throat. So she just nodded and swung up into the saddle. Vortex shifted beneath her, his muscles coiled tight, and Rhea gathered the reins. Around them, other riders were mounting up, the crowd pressing close to get a better view. The race organizer, a barrel-chested man with a voice like a foghorn, climbed onto a platform and raised his hand. All right, folks, 20 miles, rough terrain, no rules except don't kill each other and cross the finish line first. First prize is $1,000. Second prize is bragging rights. Everyone else gets dust and regret. Riders, take your positions. Rhea guided Vortex to the starting line, her heart hammering in her chest. There were maybe 30 riders total, a mix of men and women, all of them looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. Kane maneuvered his gelding next to her, close enough that their stirrups almost touched. Hope you said your goodbyes, he said, his voice low. Because you're not making it back. Rhea met his eyes, her expression flat. Guess we'll see. The organizer raised a pistol into the air, and the crowd fell silent. Rhea tightened her grip on the reins, every nerve in her body screaming. Vortex pawed the ground, ready to explode, and Rhea leaned forward in the saddle, her lips close to his ear. Run, she whispered. The pistol cracked, and the world erupted. 30 horses lunged forward as one, hooves thundering against the hard-packed earth, dust rising in a choking cloud. Rhea let Vortex have his head for the first 100 yards, letting him burn off the nervous energy, and then she reined him in, settling into a steady, ground-eating gallop. Around her, riders jostled for position, some surging ahead, others falling back, and Rhea kept her focus on the trail ahead. The first mile was deceptively easy. Flat ground, wide open, plenty of room to maneuver. But Rhea knew better than to be lulled into complacency. The real challenge would come later, when the trail narrowed and climbed into the hills. That's where riders would start dropping out, where exhaustion and poor judgment would take their toll. Kane was ahead of her, maybe 10 lengths, his gelding running flat out. Rhea resisted the urge to chase him. Let him burn his horse early. She'd catch him when it mattered. By the second mile, the pack had spread out. A few riders had already fallen behind, their horses lathered and blowing hard. Rhea kept Vortex at a steady pace, checking his breathing, feeling for any sign of strain. The stallion was moving beautifully, his strides long and even, his ears pricked forward. He wasn't just running, he was enjoying it. The trail started to climb at mile 3, the ground turning rocky and uneven. Rhea shifted her weight, balancing in the saddle, and Vortex adjusted without breaking stride. Behind her, she heard a horse stumble and a rider curse, but she didn't look back, couldn't afford to. Kane was still ahead, but the gap was closing. His gelding was a good horse, fast and strong, but it didn't have Vortex's stamina. Rhea could see the way the animal was starting to labor, its stride shortening, its head bobbing. Kane was pushing too hard, too soon, and it was going to cost him. At mile 5, the trail narrowed to a single-file path that cut along the side of a steep hill. To the left was a sheer drop-off, maybe 50 feet down to a rocky creek bed. To the right was a wall of stone, jagged and unyielding. Rhea's stomach clenched, but she kept her hands steady on the reins, trusting Vortex to pick his way through. They were halfway across when Kane's gelding stumbled. It wasn't a bad stumble, just a misstep, a hoof catching on a loose rock, but it was enough to throw the horse off balance. Kane yanked on the reins, overcorrecting, and the gelding's hindquarters swung out toward the edge. For a heart-stopping moment, Rhea thought they were both going over. But Kane recovered, dragging the horse back onto the trail, his face pale and his jaw set. Rhea passed him without a word, and she felt his eyes burning into her back. By mile 8, half the riders had dropped out. Some had turned back, their horses too exhausted to continue. Others had taken wrong turns, disappearing into side trails that would lead them miles off course. Rhea kept her eyes on the flags marking the route, trusting the organizers to guide her true. Vortex was still strong, but Rhea could feel the strain starting to creep in. His breathing was heavier, his coat slick with sweat. She reached down and patted his neck, murmuring encouragement, and the stallion's ears flicked back toward her. At mile 10, the trail dropped into a canyon, not the same one Rhea had ridden through during the flood, but similar. Narrow, winding, with walls that seemed to press in from both sides. The footing was treacherous, loose gravel and broken rock, and Rhea had to slow Vortex to a trot to keep him from falling. Kane was behind her now, close enough that she could hear his gelding's labored breathing. He was pushing hard, trying to close the gap, and Rhea knew he'd make a move soon. She just had to be ready. They emerged from the canyon at mile 12, and the trail opened up into a wide meadow. It was beautiful, wildflowers dotting the grass, the hills rising green and rolling in the distance, but Rhea barely noticed. She was too focused on the trail ahead, on the finish line that was still 8 miles away. Kane made his move at mile 13. His gelding surged forward, closing the gap in seconds, and Kane pulled alongside her, his face twisted with rage. "You think you've won? You think you've beaten me?" Rhea didn't answer. She just leaned forward in the saddle, urging Vortex faster. Kane's hand shot out, grabbing for her reins. Rhea jerked them away, but the motion threw her off balance, and Vortex shied, his hooves skidding on the loose dirt. Kane's gelding crashed into them, shoulder to shoulder, and for a moment Rhea thought she was going to be thrown, but she held on. She clamped her legs tight around Vortex's sides. Her hands locked on the saddle horn, and the stallion found his footing. He lunged forward, teeth bared, and snapped at Kane's gelding. The other horse squealed and veered away, and Kane cursed, yanking on the reins. "Stay the hell away from me," Rhea shouted, her voice raw. Kane's response was lost in the thunder of hooves, but Rhea didn't care. She focused on the trail, on Vortex, on the rhythm of his breathing and the feel of his muscles bunching and releasing beneath her. They were in this together, and nothing, not Kane, not exhaustion, not fear, was going to stop them now. At mile 15, Rhea's body started to fail. Her thighs burned, her back screamed, and her hands were so cramped she could barely feel the reins. Every breath felt like fire, and her vision swam with exhaustion. But she didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Vortex was struggling too. His strides had shortened, his breathing harsh and ragged. Rhea could feel the tremor in his legs, the way his body was starting to give out. She leaned forward, pressing her face against his mane, and whispered, "Just a little more. Please, just a little more." The stallion's ears flicked back, and somehow, impossibly, he found another gear. His strides lengthened, his breathing evened out, and they surged forward. At mile 17, the trail climbed again, steep and brutal. Rhea dismounted and led Vortex on foot, her legs shaking so badly she could barely stand. Behind her, she could hear Kane doing the same, his curses echoing off the rocks. The sun beat down mercilessly, and Rhea's vision blurred with sweat and dust. But she kept moving. One step, then another, then another. At mile 18, they crested the hill, and Rhea could see the finish line in the distance. It was maybe 2 miles away, marked by a banner strung between two posts, and a crowd had gathered, cheering and shouting. Rhea's heart lurched, and she swung back into the saddle, her body protesting every movement. "Come on, boy, we're almost there." Vortex broke into a gallop, and Rhea felt tears sting her eyes. They were going to make it. Against all odds, through pain and fear and Kane's dirty tricks, they were going to make it. But Kane wasn't done. At mile 19, he caught up again. His gelding was on its last legs, foam dripping from its mouth, its eyes rolling white. But Kane didn't care. He dug his spurs into the horse's sides, driving it forward with brutal, desperate force. "I'm not losing to you," he screamed, his voice hoarse. Rhea glanced back, and what she saw made her stomach turn. Kane had a whip in his hand, and he was lashing his gelding with it, over and over, blood streaking the horse's flanks. The animal was running on pure terror, its body shaking, its breath coming in desperate, wheezing gasps. "Stop!" Rhea shouted. "You're killing it!" Kane didn't stop. He just kept whipping, kept driving, his face twisted into something inhuman. Rhea made a split-second decision. She reined Vortex in, slowing just enough for Kane to pull ahead. The gelding stumbled past her, and Rhea saw the moment its legs gave out. The horse went down hard, crashing into the dirt, and Kane was thrown from the saddle. He hit the ground with a sickening thud and didn't move. Rhea pulled Vortex to a stop and dismounted, running over to where the gelding lay. The horse was still breathing, but its eyes were glazed, its body trembling. Rhea knelt beside it, her hands shaking, and looked up at the crowd that had started to gather. "Someone get a vet," she shouted. "Now!" Kane groaned, pushing himself up onto his hands and knees. Blood dripped from a gash on his forehead, and his face was pale. The race doesn't matter," Rhea said, her voice hard. "You just killed your horse for nothing." Kane stared at her, and for a moment something like shame flickered across his face, but then it was gone, replaced by the same cold arrogance. "You think you're better than me? You think you've won?" Rhea stood, her fists clenched. "I think you're a coward who doesn't deserve to own a horse, let alone a ranch. And I think everyone here just saw exactly what kind of man you are." The crowd murmured, and Rhea saw the way people were looking at Kane, not with respect or fear, but with disgust. Sheriff Garrett pushed through the throng, his face grim, and knelt beside the fallen gelding. "This animal's in bad shape," he said quietly. "Might not make it." Kane's face went white, and he stumbled back, his hands shaking. Rhea didn't wait to see what happened next. She turned, swung back into the saddle, and urged Vortex forward. They crossed the finish line alone. The crowd erupted in cheers, but Rhea barely heard them. She slid out of the saddle and collapsed onto the ground, her body giving out completely. Vortex stood over her, his head lowered, his breath warm on her face. She reached up and wrapped her arms around his neck, holding on like he was the only solid thing left in the world.
"We did it," she whispered. "We actually did it." Darren was there a moment later, pulling her to her feet, his arms tight around her. "You won! You won!" Maggie threw herself at Rhea, sobbing and laughing at the same time. Luis and Red were there too, both of them grinning like fools, and the crowd pressed close, clapping Rhea on the back, shouting congratulations. The race organizer pushed through the throng, holding an envelope. "First place, Miss Callahan, $1,000. Hell of a ride." Rhea took the envelope with trembling hands, and when she opened it, the sight of the bills made her knees weak. It was enough. More than enough. The ranch was saved. She turned to Darren, and the look on his face, relief, pride, something deeper, made her chest ache. "We did it," she said again. "No," Darren said quietly. "You did it." The weeks that followed were a blur of paperwork and celebrations. Darren paid off the mortgage, and the bank released the lien on the ranch. Kane, disgraced and facing charges for animal cruelty, left town without a word. His gelding survived, barely, and was taken in by a local rancher who promised to give it the care it deserved. Rhea stayed. There was no grand decision, no moment of clarity. She just woke up one morning and realized she didn't want to leave. Iron Hollow had become home in a way no place ever had before. Messy, imperfect, full of people who drove her crazy and animals that tested her patience. But it was hers. Darren offered her a partnership in the ranch, and Rhea accepted. They worked side by side, repairing fences, training horses, building something that felt solid and real. Maggie blossomed under Rhea's attention, learning to ride and care for the horses with a fierce dedication that reminded Rhea of herself at that age. And Vortex ran free. Rhea never sold him, never broke him to anyone else's hand. He was hers, and she was his, and that was enough. On quiet evenings, she'd ride him through the hills, the two of them moving as one, and she'd think about how far they'd both come. From broken, scared, and alone to something stronger, something whole. One evening, as the sun set over the hills and painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Darren found her sitting on the porch, Vortex grazing nearby. He settled into the chair beside her, and for a long time, they just sat in comfortable silence. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked finally. Rhea glanced at him. "Not anymore." "Good. Because I don't think Maggie could take it. Or me, for that matter." Rhea smiled. "You're stuck with me now, Holt." "Wouldn't have it any other way." He reached over and took her hand, his fingers warm and rough and real. Rhea squeezed back, and they sat there together, watching the sun sink below the horizon. In the end, it wasn't the dramatic race or the courtroom battles or even the flood that had saved them. It was the small, quiet moments, the trust built one day at a time. The decision to stay when leaving would have been easier. The choice to believe that broken things could be mended if you were willing to put in the work. Rhea had come to Iron Hollow chasing a challenge, but she'd found something far more valuable: a family. Imperfect, stubborn, and sometimes infuriating, but hers. And as Vortex lifted his head from the grass and walked over to the porch, pressing his nose against her shoulder, Rhea realized that some bonds couldn't be broken. Not by fear, not by pain, not by anything the world threw at them. They were bound by something stronger than force. They were bound by trust, by choice, by the simple, stubborn refusal to give up on each other. And in the harsh, unforgiving frontier, that was the only kind of strength that mattered.